Mm. Yes, a bygone era, perhaps, but there you go. Yeah, to answer your question about the Royal Society of Arts, it's an institution in the UK which has been established for a very long time. And in terms of arts, it represents the arts subjects. So, not only art and performing art, but also things like philosophy and literature and that sort of thing. And it's quite an honor to be invited to join, and it's even more of an honor to become a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. And I was invited following a publication of, actually you can see it just in the top corner of my screen. It's a collection of 6 volumes that I published for Sage on everything to do with coaching and mentoring. It's called a major work series, and it took me an awfully long time to put it together, but it's a collection of authoritative research papers on coaching and mentoring with an introduction written by myself. And as a result of that, they offered me this fellowship, which is quite a nice thing to have. And it means that if and when I travel to London, I've got somewhere to stay very cheaply because they've got accommodation and things like that and all that sort of stuff. So there you go. So thank you very much for joining. I think Paul's right to say that I'm probably a mentoring and coaching obsessive, and I have been for a very long time. It's been something which I've been involved in terms of doing it, having it done to me, researching it, writing about it, reading about it, living it, doing it to my family, and so on. So it's, and actually, curiously, my eldest daughter, who's, well, I've just had lunch with actually, is doing a postgraduate certificate in coaching and mentoring with me at the moment. And I'm not allowed to mark her work, but we had some very interesting conversations over lunch, and it's always great to hear somebody who's starting out on their journey of understanding coaching and mentoring to engage with them in conversation. So so that's great. So I had some discussions on email with Paul about what to do this evening, and what we're going to look at is what's going on with both coaching and mentoring around the world. But we're going to kind of generate some questions as a result of that. So I'll explain that as we kind of go through. But before we get going, I'm interested to know what will enable you to say at the end of this session, I'm really glad I attended this. So please use the chat or speak. What would enable you to say, I'm really glad I attended this session? Any thoughts on that matter?
I think one of my questions would be, what's the difference between what the heck they're doing over in the US and Europe? Because I heard there are differences there. You know?
Certainly.
Capturing that's one of my favorite questions, I think.
Okay, well, we're certainly going to look at that, Paul. Yeah. Anything else? Anybody want to type anything in the chat or just speak? Whatever you want to do, really.
I could add in on, I'm curious right at the topic, actually getting an understanding of what is going on around the world, so I would have better questions to ask.
Oh, okay, fabulous. Thank you, Ulrika. Good. Any other thoughts?
I'm also thinking this is interesting, this what Paul said about the difference between career mentoring and developmental mentoring and the different approaches and what's going on there, and are they merging or are they still different, or what can we see about that?
Yeah, okay, thank you, Ravi. Thank you. So we've got a question here, how to make most value of diversity. Diversity is a subject very close to me, very important. Personally, I think it's one of the biggest challenges we face as humankind, apart from perhaps climate change, but maybe they're the two biggest challenges we face. So yeah, okay. Any other thoughts before we get going? Okay, well, let's move on from that. And things may occur to you as we go along. So please feel free to put things into the chat as you see fit, and I'll keep an eye on it and respond to things as they come in. So two questions to ask you, another two questions to ask you. You're investing time and effort to be here on this webinar. My question to you is, well, so what? I mean, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to you to be here? And I don't have an answer to that question. And you may not have an answer to that question yet. But what I'd like you to do is keep that question in your mind as we go through the session. Because in thinking about what's being talked about and relating it to your own experience, your own understanding, is what it's all about, really. And that's really important. And I think also that once you've thought about what this stuff is that I'm going to be talking about has to do with you and your background and your experience, the follow-up question is, what next? What might you do about it? What actions might you take? What thoughts might you have? What are you going to go and read? What are you going to go and do as a result of having this session today? So 2 questions to hold in your mind, and I'll come back to that right at the very end and see whether you've come up with anything. I mean, you may have, you might not, I don't know, but we'll see. So hold those questions. So the first thing that I'm going to think about, which was raised a bit by Rabbi and a bit by Paul, is about the problem of definition. The problem of definition of this thing that we call coaching and this thing that we call mentoring. And what's very clear to me, Paul?
Are you sharing your screen?
No, indeed I'm not. Thank you very much. I will now. There you go. Okay, so the first issue is problem of definition. So yeah, this thing we call coaching, this thing we call mentoring. Often it comes up over and over again that people say to me, what's the difference between coaching and mentoring? And I have an answer to that, a very straightforward answer, which is it all depends on whose book you read. But there's another answer which goes with it. It all depends where you are in the world as to what you think coaching is and what you think mentoring is. And I've experienced this many, many times. I remember many years ago working in the Netherlands, and I was supposed to be doing a session on mentoring, and somebody came up to me in the coffee break and said, Bob, I think you're talking about coaching. And I said, really? And they said, yeah, over here, this is what we understand by coaching. And I went, right, okay. So what do you understand by mentoring? So, you know, again, we kind of opened up this thought about it. And it's something which I've thought about a lot over many years. And I think there is a problem of the word definition. And the problem of the word definition is that it tries to pin something down. It tries to get a kind of great big hammer and a great big nail and go bang, 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 that's it. We've decided that's coaching, this is mentoring. And the problem with that is that both coaching and mentoring are what I call social constructions. Human beings made them up. They weren't something existing there as something kind of independent of people. And we made them up. And so they follow social rules, which does in fact make definition a very difficult thing to do, because in one situation, it means something, and in a different situation, it might mean something else. So a few years ago, I came across, I was invited to examine a doctoral thesis, a PhD thesis. And this thesis was about looking at definition. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole thesis. I'm just going to go into the central point that this person decided to abandon the idea of definition. And I thought, great, what a good idea. Let's abandon that. What's the alternative? And she came up with this idea of talking to different groups of people who called themselves different things. So we had, you know, career mentor, executive mentor, mentor for young people. We had, you know, executive coach. We had performance coach. We had sports coach and that sort of thing. And what she did is interview a very large group of people. And she came up with what I call a series of dimensions, which is like this. She came up with 8 positions. And she found that actually taking this descriptive approach to these things and these different versions of coaching and mentoring was, in fact, I found it a really fascinating thing to do. And what she came up with was, on one dimension, there's what she called the developmental attitude that goes on within that discussion, or a deficit attitude which goes on with that discussion. And the deficit is, you know, people might genuinely not know about something, in which case, how do you deal with that when you're working with somebody one-to-one? They genuinely might not know. So the idea that something is within them when it clearly isn't is a little bit challenging. So how do we work with this relationship between what's developmental and what's a deficit, and how do we deal with that? Now, one of the things I've learned, and you may be there as well, is that actually telling people what to do or giving them advice is not helpful. However, sharing experience and using it as like data to be analyzed, or providing information to be discussed, can actually be quite developmental. So if somebody genuinely doesn't know, we might not be teaching them, but we might be sharing some experience to enable them to think this thing through. And then it becomes a developmental, and that deficit gets filled. Then there's this question of how directive or non-directive are we going to be in mentoring and or coaching. And bearing in mind that pre-2000, coaching was considered as something very directive, very much associated with sport and very much associated with teaching people craft skills and that kind of thing. But that changed around 2000, which is quite an interesting date to kind of consider. But yeah, so how directive or non-directive are we? And both versions of coaching and mentoring can be both of those things. Also, how future-oriented is this discussion, or how past-oriented is this discussion? And generally speaking, I would say most versions of coaching and most versions of mentoring tend to have a future orientation, although there may be some exceptions. And then the other is, are these relationships long-term or are they short-term? And often mentoring relationships tend to be on the longer term, and coaching relationships tend to be on the shorter term, but not always, So instead of saying this is coaching, this is mentoring, the invitation is to think about it in terms of dimensions as to how developmental, what's the deficit, how directive, how non-directive, how future-oriented, how past-oriented, how long-term, how short-term. So this was an absolutely wonderful gift from somebody who did some doctoral research, I think, to the whole question of knowledge and practice of coaching and mentoring. My colleague, Paul Stokes, who Rabé knows very well, and some other colleagues, an academic from France called Pauline Fatillon, some of you may have come across her work, they took this idea of dimensions and they looked at what they called the discourses found in mentoring and the discourses found in coaching. So how are people talking about this business? And what they said is that there are some, in the literature, there are some typical discourses which are associated with coaching, and there are some typical discourses that are associated with mentoring. You can have this presentation, by the way, and it will be recorded, so that's fine, you can study it. And then what they argued was that there's this context business, which I talked about previously. Where does this happen, and what's the kind of context? So the learning context for mentoring in terms of the discourse in the literature says It's a kind of growth, learning oriented way of going on. It's an opportunity for development, perhaps an expectations that people may rethink, reframe what it is they are doing. If there is a more performance orientation, which we find a lot in the literature about coaching, then it's about goals and it's about three-party contracts. Is the learning environment, talking about it with the manager, a recommendation that the EMCC makes, an expectation of behavioral change, which will go along with that, and so on. I'm not going to read every bit out, but as you can see, there's the economic context. So we think about the economy involved in coaching, which tends to be a paid relationship, a contracted relationship, and the coach is a service provider. Whereas in mentoring, it tends to be reciprocal or exchange-based, a partner or a friend, and tends not to be paid. Although in some circumstances it is. Depends on where you are. I heard of a brilliant mentoring scheme in Australia, which was about mentoring young people to develop their own businesses, where the organization charged mentors to take part in the program. So the mentors came from industry. They had to pay to mentor these young people. The mentor pays. I thought that was a brilliant idea, because in this way, the organization was raising funds. The mentor was quite keen to pay because they were getting a lot of development in learning about how to mentor somebody. So what an interesting concept that is. Thank you, Australia, for that particular version. We've got the temporal context, which I've talked about a little bit about time. What's the time pressure on these things, and the socio-cultural context. I think this is quite an interesting thing from the literature in coaching. We're talking about expertise with the process, and that expertise is verified by some kind of accreditation, qualification, degree, whatever it happens to be. Whereas we look at mentoring and the social cultural context, and it's often industry or job related experience, similar backgrounds of people verified by the very experiences that they've had, rather than some kind of accreditation or qualification. So again, this is another alternative framework to the idea of definitions. I'm just going to pause for a few moments there and wonder how you're responding to this.
I think it's brilliant.
Okay. What's brilliant about it? That's a good coaching question, Paul.
I mean, the whole concept of discourse, because we're in this definition, and in particular for coaches, they kind of say, okay, mentoring, that's something very, very different. And you're portraying it is contextual, which is definitely it is.
Yes.
Everything we do as executive coaches are contextual.
Yes.
And tend to be between mentoring and coaching somewhere.
Yes.
So this narrow definition doesn't really make sense.
Sure.
And it is a continuum.
Mm-hmm.
But you're highlighting that at the end of these continuums, you have concepts that are inside of or being used in the discourse.
Yeah.
And I think I really like that kind of 50,000 feet overview.
Yeah, it's a kind of mapping. Rabbe, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I like this. What you said about the definition, it's kind of banging something into a form, and then when you are in the form, you are caught in that form.
Yes.
So opening up and making it to whatever is helpful for you and the other in the context is helpful, because we are different and talking about diversity. So make your mix of it and see whatever is helpful in the moment. I think that's and then you can call it.
Yeah, and the defining issue is what your coachee or mentees is and where they are and that sort of thing. And I think that's really important. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the latest work from Reinhard Stelter, who's recently published just last year a new book. He calls it the third generation of coaching, and he's writing extensively about a repositioning of both coach and mentor as facilitators of dialogue. And he argues that there's a kind of hybrid version of going on. And if you're genuinely facilitating dialogue, you might flip from one to the other. So Ulrika, what did you want to say?
No, I just actually wanted to add to, I totally agree with Rabbi and Paul in this, and it feels very humane. Like it's more human, more about the complexity of us as humans instead of being stuck in something rigid.
Yes,
it opens up and gives us more of this, well, to serve the complexity of us, and that we have a more dynamic.
Yes.
The play field suddenly just expands.
Yeah, well, indeed it does. And what this paper argues is that it's context and purpose that are really important, and they're infinitely variable and often defined by the person that you're actually working with in the moment. And so that kind of flexibility becomes quite important. Okay, we kind of hang that in the background because this is the kind of background, if you like, to where I'm going with this. I'm going to start. So that's the background. I'm going to start with a few other contextual things, and then we'll have some questions, and then we'll move on and look at what the research is showing us about what's going on around the world with these things called coaching and mentoring. So starting point one is that many sociologists, not psychologists, sociologists are arguing that globalization has brought with us a problem, and a problem that they call neo-feudalism. And what they mean by that is that a new kind of feudalistic society has emerged right across the world. And what that is power and wealth held by very few people, and they control the rest of us by the power and wealth that they hold. And yes, some of them are playing with space rockets at the moment, for example, as if that's a really good thing to be doing in this current climate and with climate change, etc. Not to mention any names, of course, but you know, there you go. And what these sociologists are arguing is there's a problem, because what comes with that is a whole series of mirrored behaviors of neo-feudalism, which get played out in our organizations, not in small organizations, but in larger organizations, where you've got concentrations of power in the top of these organizations, which justifies the exorbitantly large salaries that they think they should be paid. And yet they're kind of dictating to others and expecting others to comply with what they say. Now, I think that's a challenging concept. Whoops, I've just flipped on too quickly there. A challenging concept, but I think it's one which comes from the sociological world, and I think it's an interesting idea. And I put a couple of references up there if you wanted to have a look. But just type into Google new feudalism, and you'll have a really interesting time. And it comes with issues of control, compliance, expectations that people will obey what's going on, sets of rules. And one could argue, and some of these writers argue, that coaching in particular in organizational contexts could be viewed as a form of surveillance to extract compliance out of people, particularly when we're talking about performance. So it's a kind of ownership of who, you know, whose performance is a big question that he's asked. So that's another starting point that we'll go with. Another starting point related to that is that these organizations are under a lot of pressure to create these coherent global strategies, which brings, as Andre said earlier, this kind of it raises a diversity question for us. And this internationalization is often thought that needs to come through HR systems. And so they seek to lower their costs, which is, you know, straightforward good capitalism, lower your costs, identify the best economic practices of organizational management, and then standardize that across your global institutions. And this is a very common trend that we see in organizations, that there's this kind of standardization which is going right across their international places. And that for me raises some questions. And one of those questions is, or a set of those questions is, what about local differences in management practices? What about the political climate in these different parts of the world? What about religious and social differences? What about attitudes, values, and ethics? What about the stage these different places are in their technical development? Because it's not all equal. It's not all the same. And what about workforce demographics, where they come from, who they are, what the mix is of different cultural backgrounds and ages and races and religious beliefs and so on and so forth. And so the previous point about trying to standardize isn't necessarily taking into consideration these other issues which we know exist. This morning I was delivering a workshop with senior people from the charity Save the Children, which you may have come across, a very well-known, large international charity. And one of the women that I was talking to, I see Paul's got the same issue that I have. I've put mine in the kitchen, Paul. He always wants to join me when I'm on a Zoom call. The cat walks right across the camera.
The path goes always on the keyboard.
Yeah, exactly. Tap, 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 tap. Yeah, yeah. Actually, I've got a picture which I have used sometimes on Zoom calls, where the caption is how to prepare for a Zoom call, and there's a picture of somebody sitting at the computer, and taped to the wall is the cat. That's very funny. Anyway, so coming back to this, you know, are these standardized practices, are they taking into account these local differences? And this person I was talking to from Save the Children, who's currently working in a place that not many of us would like to go to, which is Iraq. And she was saying that they're trying to develop coaching and mentoring activity there. And she was saying, can you imagine how difficult it is for me as a woman to be interacting with a male Iraqi? First of all, that's not on. To have a one-to-one relationship in that sense. And the other is, I'm more senior than them and they expect me to tell them what to do. That's how it works. They expect to be taught. So how do I work with that? How do I work with that situation? I've also currently been working with an organization, some of you may have heard of, called Youth Business International. And they provide mentoring support for young people all around the world to support young people to start and grow their own enterprises, their own businesses. And it's very clear that in the different parts of the world where Youth Business International operates, which is in 50 different countries, there's a different understanding about what mentoring means. So in India, for example, they position it as a kind of gurudom, which here in the West, in the developed Northern Hemisphere, we would say, well, I don't know about that idea, but it kind of works for them there because that's how they understand things to work. So yeah, I think these are important considerations. So another question, 3 questions, is that this idea of standardization and then looking across the world, we could think of it in terms of 3 ways. One is convergence. So how far are different parts in the world converging and standardizing and becoming similar? How far are they diverging? And how far are they kind of cross-verging, compromising, having a mixture of the two different ideas? And these are the questions that we asked ourselves when we decided to collect case studies from different parts of the world. And this is part of an ongoing project that Paul and I are working on is collecting case studies from different parts. So we've just started really, and this is the beginning of it. So some questions. If we bring it to coaching and mentoring, these things that we're here to talk about, how far is convergence appropriate and necessary across the world? And how far is convergence possible and desirable? And how far is divergence appropriate? Now, I'm asking this question because I can argue that the main professional bodies that represent coaching and mentoring would hope to seek for a degree of convergence, I believe. And therein sits a little bit of a challenge. Any responses to that? Any thoughts?
I can go again.
Okay, Paul, thank you.
I think you're right in convergence, and I think we are pretty oblivious about some of the differences, to be honest. Pretending that that coaching is the same in China as it is in the US, as it is across, and obviously as providers to big corporations, we are playing the convergent game because the management practices.
Yep.
But the issues that we are facing and the environments and the people we are facing, except on the highest levels, are very, very different.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you for that. Let's move on then, and we'll just think about what we did. We've been to we approached people that we knew in 9 different places. As I said, there's lots more things that we can do. And we gathered case studies, and we asked these people to supply responses to certain questions about what they saw in relation to coaching and mentoring in their own countries. And the question that we were working on is how far are professional bodies following the same patterns as the near-feudalistic tendency of globalized business? Big question, challenging question, I know. So that was the question we worked on, and we were looking at this data that was coming back through these case studies and asking the question, what are we noticing that's going on around the world? So these are the cases, and I'll give you some of the information that we got from them. So I'm going to go through the 9 cases. If you've got any questions, do ask as we go through. So I mentioned Australia. Let's go to Australia. What's clear is in Australia, coaching and mentoring activity seems widespread. There's loads of it. The dominant professional body is the ICF in Australia. The Association of Coaches is gaining some kind of traction as an alternative to the ICF. The question of supervision of coaching and or mentoring is developing, but the uptake on it is sporadic. There's some objections, even though it is something which is advised and recommended by the ICF and indeed the AAC. So members aren't necessarily complying with that particular request. The Association of Coaches approach to supervision is informed by what they call psychological mindedness rather than psychologically educated. So people who are psychologically aware. And the supervision process is continuous professional development, basically. That's the line that they take with it. And they tend not to follow the same line as, for example, advocated by the EMCC on supervision. So it's purely a professional development process. There is training beginning to start for supervisors in Australia, seen as important. It's just beginning. Complete lack of consensus about the similarities and differences between coaching and mentoring, as we've just seen. HR professionals are trying to draw on both external help to unravel some of these issues, as well as in order to create internal systems for their own uses. And it's possible that the three professional bodies, and the EMCC being a new entrant in Australia, is possibly the source of help. Possibly. We'll see. We'll see. So this is Australia, and I would say that largely Australia, an industrialized country, very much so, very much influenced by the managerial type discourse, which we're also familiar with. I would see as a country that's convergent. Paul.
Yeah, I wonder because in Australia, I know that coaching psychology is very strong.
It is indeed.
University of Sydney, do they have an influence in there? You're not mentioning them.
I think they do to an extent, and the person that supplied me this case study is a graduate of there. So yeah, I think actually I'll come back to the psychological influence, but I think you're right that there is an influence which is coming from there in Australia as well. But a lot of that is positioned as life coaching, not quite the same. So yeah, interesting, but lots of variations. I would see Australia as working towards convergence, if you like. America, here we go, Paul. Mentoring in America is associated with development. Now, in the past, David Clutterbuck was saying that there was a career orientation to mentoring and career sponsorship rather than developmental, which we see in Europe. I think that's changed. Certainly in my interactions in America, mentoring is associated far more with developmental activity. And as Paul said, I'm doing a webinar every single fortnight for this American university at the moment for the whole year. And it's very clear that the kind of learning and development agenda is quite strong in how they appreciate and understand mentoring rather than career progression, career development, sponsorship. So I think that's changed. I think that was the case, but I think it's shifted. Maybe they've learned from Europe. Let's hope so. There's a lot of mentoring goes on at school level in the United States. So, it's likely that in a few year time, you're going to have people emerging from the school system with some good understanding about what mentoring might be because they would have experienced it at school. There's also been experimentation in the States with things like reverse mentoring, team and group mentoring a little bit less, but reverse mentoring is becoming quite popular in the States. I think that's a challenging concept. It's where the idea of the hierarchy or the age or the differences is turned upside down. So in some cases, it would be where the younger person, less experienced person is mentoring the older, more experienced person around things that perhaps they need to understand and learn. I know that in my daughter's organization, there's an attempt to do that, but she says the senior executives only play lip service and don't really engage with the process. So there you go. Mentoring, again, in the States, growth and development, onboarding, intergenerational support, it gets employed for that purpose, and in diversity programs, marginalized groups. So quite strong social orientation for mentoring in the United States these days, particularly with organizations like Big Sisters, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Roots and Wings, various schemes like that are common in the United States. Coaching is for performance, almost exclusively for high potentials. There is a development in the United States of coaching not only using external people, but there's this movement towards developing internal coaches within their own organizations as becoming a strong trend. There is an increase in in-company coach education, far more than there ever was. So coaching is beginning to appear on standard management training courses now. The dominant body, not surprising, being the United States, is the ICF. There's not much presence of anything else. Although what's interesting is that the numbers of membership of the ICF in America is not that high. It's under 10,000, which I find a little bit surprising. I think if you were to look at the collective membership of the ICF around the world, it's a lot higher than that. So interesting. And managerial coaching with an emphasis on productivity is also becoming quite important in the United States. Moving on now, and I would say the United States is a convergent place, particularly in terms of coaching and ICF, if you like. Moving on to look at South America. Now, this I find absolutely fascinating, and I really like what is going on there. Certainly, coaching is increasing and developing in South American countries. There is a strong ICF presence. They get everywhere, ubiquitous. However, in South America, in South American countries, there are a lot of political issues to be dealt with. As I'm sure you may see when you look at international news, there are some challenges in South America. The question of supervision isn't really present. It's very much in its infancy. What is strong in South America, South American countries, and I've listed some of them where it's been employed, is strong concerns for local issues. So a very strong localized environment there, and a very strong charitable orientation of both coaching and mentoring, where coaching and mentoring are used as movements of social change. So they're being employed to help emancipate people in South America. And in South America, there's been some history around that. We had, you know, in the 1980s, I believe it was, we had Augustus Boal, who was writing about the theater of the oppressed and using drama as a way of helping people to become emancipated, for example. And this is how coaching and mentoring is being used in South America, in localized areas. And I find that particularly interesting and very exciting. In York, where I live in the UK, in the northeast of the UK, I'm the honorary president of a social enterprise called Coaching York. And Coaching York's focus is entirely focused on community work. And if you want to pay your subscription and become a member of Coaching York, you have to donate a certain number of hours per year to the community projects that we're running free of charge. And in return, you become a member of Coaching York, and you can access CPD events, which we run pretty regularly for people. And so the whole focus is on doing work within our local community within York and a little further out. And there's been a lot of interest in that in the UK. Other parts of the UK have been contacting us saying, how have you done it? I tell you, it's been hard work. How have you done it? How have you got there? What are you doing? Where are you focusing? So I think there's an interesting parallel here between what people seem to be doing in South America and what we're attempting to do here in York in the northeast of the UK. And I know that other parts of the UK have started to get interested as we've been trying to publicize what we've been doing. Czech Republic, interesting place to go. I mean, yes, both are developing, remembering that the Czech Republic is a developing economy, very much so. Or I would say that South America is divergent. It's doing things differently. Czech Republic, two main professional bodies in operation, a strong focus on individuals and individual performance. Coach training is very much on the increase. A few recognized educational institutions are now getting interested in coaching and to some extent mentoring. There's a lot of development of internal coaches and mentoring activity inside organizations as part of a cost reduction exercise as the economy has been under pressure. So they're looking for, you know, developing coaches or mentors within their organization. and there's not really a widespread understanding of supervision. So although there is a strong EMCC presence in the Czech Republic, I would say that it was kind of somewhere between divergent and convergent. So it hasn't moved completely in the direction of travel. The Russian Federation, fascinating. Coaching has been established since the 1990s in Russia. Mentoring is a more recent addition, pretty recent actually, last 15 years. And that's particularly in the entrepreneurial sector where Youth Business International have been developing. And it's important to remember that in Russia, entrepreneurship was illegal during the Soviet years. It was not allowed. And therefore, you know, developing entrepreneurship and doing it ethically through the use of mentoring is a challenge that people in Youth Business International have been experiencing. Coaching it seems to be in decline in Russia, mainly because of the economic issues. Russia's not so rich as it likes to put out, and there are lots of pressures on local people. And I know this from my contacts in Russia that there's a lot of people struggling in Russia economically. And so what seems to have happened is that the coaching world has started getting competitive with each other, and they're trying to kind of drive each other out, which is, you know, all chasing after the same few cents, if you like. And coaching tends to be either based and derived directly from psychology as therapy-based activity or performance-based. Mentoring is developed, as I said, in particular to youth entrepreneurship. Education is developing an interest in mentoring. I went to Russia about 3 years ago and had meetings with the Department of Education in Russia to talk about mentoring and how it might work in the school sector. And there was a lot of interest at that time. The way they've developed mentoring in Russia has been very much based not on what professional bodies say, but on what they call best international practice. So they've been influenced a lot by lots of different people who have been researching the subject and have been helping them to kind of develop what they do there. And also the YBI network draws on its network to you know, learn from each other. So I've just been involved in a series of webinars that have been all around the world for Youth Business International, where the mentors have been sharing best practice with each other, sharing experiences with each other. And it's through that kind of approach that I think changes like the Indian guru system are likely to happen, because it's through people working on it themselves, talking about things of mutual interest and sharing experiences that you get these global changes going on, which I think is extremely interesting to be witnessing and being part of that. So that's good. Also an increased use of technology in Russia because of the huge distances. So a lot of online stuff is going on, not just because of COVID, but because of the huge distances there. And also the Russian mentoring operations are expanding to other Eastern countries as well, Eastern European countries. Hong Kong is interesting. Hong Kong views coaching as a Western import. And much of the coaching that goes on in Hong Kong is influenced by Western educated, mainly US people in Hong Kong. But the case seemed to show that people in Hong Kong are quite happy about working within an individualistic concept and the role of the coach, as well as thinking collectively about what goes on in their particular culture, where a coach may be viewed as the facilitator of learning. And in Hong Kong, people seem to be comfortable with the idea that the coachee is able to come to their own conclusion. But there is a challenge of language here, because the word coach in Chinese apparently translates to teaches or the practicer of drills. So a kind of very technical approach. And so there are some misunderstandings of language if coaching is attempted to be introduced into the Hong Kong setting. There has been attempts to try and shift the meaning of that word and try to express it more as coaching as inspiring or enlightening. Very little mentoring observed in Hong Kong, mostly coaching, as I say, mostly influenced by the United States of America. I would see that Hong Kong is the sort of place in relation to coaching that is particularly cross-virgin. It's a kind of mixture of lots of things. You've got the cultural forces coming in, and you've also got the kind of American influences going on as well. Paul.
Yeah, I was fascinated by the last comment you had.
Yep.
Because in the middle of your slide, it says a coach is viewed as a facilitator of learning.
Right,
and that is a mentoring attitude, right? So
yeah, sure, absolutely.
You elaborate a bit on that?
Well, I think that what you've got in Hong Kong is a kind of coaching has kind of come in as a kind of Western idea, and organizations have adopted the idea. There are people practicing as coaches in Hong Kong. And one level they view that as facilitator of learning, which, as you say, could be seen as a mentor, but they seem to stick with the word coaching. And then you've got this interesting challenge of how the word translates in Chinese and how that may be a kind of repositioned. The person that wrote the case study showed me the Chinese symbols, which was really interesting, and how there was a kind of meaning attached to that. And this is something I've experienced elsewhere, is how the word that's used to describe it may have different meanings to different cultures. And I'll Rabbi, you gave me the word for the mentee that you use in Sweden, if you remember. And I'm just trying to remember what it is. Adept, yes. Adept, yeah. Adept, yeah, adept. Yeah, I think that's wonderful. Okay. Saudi Arabia, an interesting case study that came from there. Saudi Arabia is a country that's changing and changing quite rapidly. There are lots of issues, as we know, in Saudi Arabia, lots of issues, but the societal and legal landscape is changing quite quickly. And I think this is partly because those people that rule the country, and I use the word deliberately, rule the country, are recognizing that the oil isn't going to last forever, and that there has to be alternatives for an economic future. And that means they've got to start liberalizing, and liberalizing quickly. And I think they're very aware of that. And my Saudi contact said to me, the Saudi royal family will do anything to keep themselves in power. And if the society is changing and there's demands that it changes, well, they'll probably change and do it quite quickly. So certainly there has been a lot of changes driven, and legal systems are changing as well. There's no longer religious police. They've been disbanded in Saudi Arabia, for example, and women are allowed to drive, which is a step forward. And also women don't have to completely cover up either in Saudi as they used to. So some changes there. Concepts, very important concepts of leadership and power that's associated with that. And there's this very strong hierarchical system. And you know, if your boss in an organization says jump, you say, how high would you like me to do that? Very much so is how it's constructed. So changes there. There is no infrastructure in Saudi for coach mentor education at all, but there is interest. And some coaches are getting credentialized through the ICF. So there's the American influence coming through into Saudi. No supervision, don't even know what it means. But there is also an increase in employed internal coaches. So people are actually employed in the organization who are coaches, ICF accredited, and they're employed as the organizational coaches, which is an interesting development. So I think that Saudi is divergent. Although we'll see how it goes over the next few years, but very strongly linked to the power and the legal systems that are there currently. Africa is an interesting case. I'll go through this one quite quickly. This was mainly in relation to Uganda, but there's a changing situation towards coaching, and this is because the ICF have moved into Uganda. There is a chapter in Uganda of the ICF, and people are being drawn to it. And so that is beginning to happen there. But there's a lot of cultural and economic change going on in that country. Coaching is seen as the expert knowledge and is paid. So very much expert knowledge the coach knows. There is strong evidence that mentoring exists, but particularly in the NGO sector, non-governmental organizations and charities, a lot of that going on in that part of the world. And actually what was clear is that there are cultural issues big time. So issues of gender. Does a female coach mentor a male? Possibly not. The other way around? Possibly yes. Dominance of advice giving as a framework. Issues of power, compliance, empowerment. How far are people that? Not really. Attitudes towards time, I found that very interesting, are African. So in the case study, you know, there's this example of Western attitudes towards time is we're on time. In Africa, it's you wait for me because I would wait for you. And lateness is not really a concept particularly, it's a construct, if you like. And there also seems to be an interesting issue about lack of boundaries in the professional separation. So crossovers and ethical issues which are encountered in the Ugandan context. So I would say Uganda, we're looking at divergence here. But we'll see what happens. And the final case, which is one which looks at the country of Sri Lanka. Not much coaching and mentoring going on. Some evidence that there's ICF interest in Sri Lanka. Not much credentializing, not interested in it, low down. Hierarchical culture tends to dampen interest in coaching and mentoring. Although mentoring has a cultural resonance with Buddhism. So it has a kind of spiritual association, a kind of wisdom, gurudom, and that may be a way in for those that are wanting to work in Sri Lanka, particularly around the mentoring piece. And business coaching in Sri Lanka is completely equated to sports coaching. So it's about goals, targets, performance, very much so. So what from all that is coaching is clearly widespread. Mentoring is generally voluntary around the world and widespread. The industrialized, economically strong parts of the world are much more accepting of the idea of convergence, compliance with what particularly the ICF says as the dominant body. There is some evidence of divergence and cross-vergence. Hong Kong, Russia, South America, Sri Lanka, and very strong influence in Sri Lanka as a new entrant by these cultural factors that we talked about. The key influencers are the economic context, which we see in all those cases, the philosophical underpinnings that people have about learning and development and about performance. They are cultural and related to African, South American, Hong Kong, Sri Lankan cases. Technology is an influencer, a driver found in the Russian case because of large distances. In Africa, not much such a case because there isn't the access to the internet there, which is an economic issue, of course. So, yeah. And legal context, notably in the Saudi case, we see political climate raised in South America, and many sociological and cultural issues are found in all those cases. And Paul and myself put together this thought about coaching and mentoring around the world and trying to get an overview of what it might look like and what are the things which influence it and affect it. And recognizing that there are more things that impact on coaching, particularly, and mentoring than psychology. And one of our arguments is that psychology has been a strong driver of coaching, in particular practice, for quite some time. In mentoring, psychology has been used to underpin it and explain theoretical ideas in mentoring, which is quite different. So psychology in coaching tends to drive the practice. But we're also arguing that there are lots of other things that might impact on this. So the economy, the sociology, the political context, psychology indeed, the psychological context, the legal context, the technological context, different philosophical and cultural ideas all impact. And so we do wonder how possible it is to create a convergent system. And maybe we need to think about something else. So let's leave it there and see what you think. What thoughts? A lot of stuff there to take in, but what thoughts are you getting?
It was very valuable for me because I'm about to move into a collaboration with 9 other universities just within Europe. And I had a meeting with them last week, and what I could notice was that we had one word, but at least 9 different understandings of what we were talking about. And even if it's just Europe, but it's Eastern Europe and different parts of Europe. So this hierarchical approach was very clear in some areas, and and the understanding that the mentor, it's about researchers finding mentors, and this understanding that the mentor should be at least at vice chancellor level in order to be able to be a mentor, and instead of having this more developmental approach to it. So I think that might be rather interesting to learn more about how we are moving forward there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also a question of how accepting we become of those different attitudes as well, because you're not going to convert people very easily. But putting stuff out there and getting people engaged in a conversation is a starting point, of course.
And that's just that's the benefit of moving away from a definition in order to have this more what's helping behaviors, and moving into that. That was a really, and because I'm a little bit still when I talk about mentoring, I'm still about talking a little bit about the American career mentoring, and so this was a really valuable refresher for updating my knowledge on that.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you, Ravi. Any other thoughts, Paul?
Yeah, I would like to add a bit there, because I was, I'm moving to Germany, and I've become interested in what is mentoring and coaching in Germany, and why isn't the German EMCC bigger than it is?
Yes.
And I discovered that there's an organization of 4,600. They call themselves supervisors.
Right.
They are very similar to the counselors in the UK.
Right.
And what they're saying is that we are much, much better than any ICF coaching, life coaching. So there's a thing going on in different areas of the world, or even in Europe, where the definition of mentoring, the definition of coaching, is not as straightforward as we would like to think in the English language.
No, absolutely. Well, even in the English language, it's problematic, because there are versions of mentoring which aren't great. And that's influenced by a publication which came out in the 19th century about this evil person called Svengali, who was inappropriately influencing people. And there are still those that, you know, and it was made into a big Hollywood film, you know, and there are still those people who associate mentoring with that kind of idea that, you know, it's inappropriate behavior, advice giving, taking over people, that sort of thing. Yeah. I've spent a lifetime talking to people about this stuff, and small progress gets made. Small progress gets made, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Ulrika, any thoughts from you?
Oh yes, I have my whole head is exploding, but I'm trying to gathering some thoughts. But
Okay.
one of the things that is really comes to me, I coach in China. I coach in the US. I have clients in Europe. One of the things that I was thinking here is, I mean, the key is always to be open to differences.
Yes.
And as you explain this, I mean, when it expands the field and we get this more dynamic approach, it makes it easier.
Yes.
Because then you don't have to be so rigid in your thinking. And I think very much about being a mentor or a coach, to be open to these differences and understanding that we come from different cultures, we have different upbringings.
Yes.
There's a mindset that is different, and that we start to be curious about in the beginning.
Yes. Yep.
To align in some way or to meet. And I feel that it is our responsibility.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think being open to difference is such an important idea. You know, we talked about convergence, divergence, crossvergence. And so, you know, thinking about everybody doing the same thing everywhere around the world, and it's an impossibility, I think.
Yes, and I think we missed something. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yes, no, carry on.
No, because I think we missed something when we think that it's going to be, I'm not good at pronouncing the word, convergent. Yeah. Convergent, thank you.
Yes, convergent. Yeah.
Convergent, but because we learn something from each other when we have the diversity.
Yes.
When there is a possibility, then our minds expand.
Yes, well, exactly. And I think this is a challenge for professional bodies like the EMCC and the ICF and all the others. Is it possible to standardize this wonderful thing which we know as mentoring, and this wonderful thing that we know as coaching, whilst recognizing that different people in different parts of the world see different purposes for it and have different ways of understanding these things, and will be in different places in terms of their appreciation of the idea, and open or not to some of the challenges which come from people like me, for example. So yeah.
Really, thank you very much for all this. Really appreciate it. It was really, wow.
Thank you. Just before the pandemic, I had somebody in Mongolia that I was coaching, a Mongolian person. And there are a couple of things that I learned from him, which were incredibly powerful. The first was, I said to him, look, I'm really going to struggle with pronouncing your name. And I said, could you say it to me a few times so that I can hear it, and then I'll give it back to you. And when I've got it right, tell me. So eventually I practiced it, and his name's Batorshik, and I got it right. And I always get it right now. And he said to me, please don't shorten my name, because lots of people in the West want to shorten my name and call me Bat. But in my culture, if you shorten my name, you shorten my life. And I went, oh, I wouldn't want to do that. That's fine. And then he said, so what do I call you? And I said, oh, well, my name's actually Robert, but in my culture, I'm known as, and what an interesting discussion that generated, as you can imagine, you know. Fantastic. Bob is a friendly term, you know, and that's acceptable to me. So we talked about that. The other thing that I learned from him was he was trying to introduce mentoring into his world. And he was struggling to know what to call it in his own language. And we had this big conversation about stories. And I said to him, you know, mentoring, for example, has stories attached to it, particularly in my culture, but other cultures as well. Curiously enough, the French have a lot of stories about mentoring, and yet they are not very happy with the word either. So anyway, let's carry on. And I said to him, is there a story in your culture that embodies these qualities, these values that we're talking about? And he said, well, yes, there is. It's the uncle of Genghis Khan. Now, we think in the West that Genghis Khan was a bit of a ruthless killer, dictator, etc., etc. Of course, in Mongolia, a hero, national hero, great warrior, all those sorts of things. And I just thought, well, there you go. History positions things in different ways, doesn't it? Depending on what side you're on. Anyway, he chose to call mentoring after the uncle of Genghis Khan. And he actually gave me a book, I've got it on my shelf somewhere, in English, which were the stories of Genghis Khan, which I've been reading. And of course, they're stories of a great hero, which is really quite interesting. So another thing that I learned is don't always believe how people are positioned in history, because it depends on which side of the fence you're sitting as to you know what the version is that you want to subscribe to, which I think is fascinating, really. Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, I had a similar experience with in a supervision stream of a conference that we had.
Yeah.
There was a lady from Kenya there.
Okay. Yeah.
And I asked her, what is the position of coaching in Kenya? And she said, no, we don't use the word coaching. We use mentoring, because we expect the hierarchy. We expect something that coaching cannot give.
Yes.
Wisdom.
Yes.
And experience.
Yes.
So that was embedded. So in other words, what she was saying is that coaching was not a concept there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Well, it is in places, and the ICF are in Kenya, but often it's in large
organizations. But tend to be with the companies, right? With Western companies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Not out in the community where mentoring is. It's quite present in Kenya. Yeah, certainly. Exactly. We need to collect a lot more case studies, you know, but it takes a long time to get all this stuff. But maybe I'll come and ask you for some from Norway and from Sweden and Denmark and the like, because that would be useful as well to get those perceptions. So
we're nearing the top of the hour now.
We are indeed.
About 10 minutes to go.
Yep.
I remember Greta was asking the question about diversity.
Yes.
I think it was Greta, and that is exactly what we're talking about now, right?
Yes, exactly. Greta, is any thoughts? There you are.
Yeah, I think diversity is a really it could be damaging, and it could be really valuable. And my simple thought in this is the 24-hour human being in a context. And then we just need to pick up what sort of context and what are our history and our future dreams and beliefs, and put that together.
Yep.
And also for me, mentoring is also this network bringing into the picture as well. Not only what you talked about, but this networking is also something I value in the mentoring theme.
Yep. No, you're absolutely right. Networking can be a part of mentoring, that you may, as a mentor, give access to your networks to the person you're mentoring, which can be useful and helpful to them. I do that sometimes, signpost people to people. We go and have a chat with so-and-so because they might be helpful, you know, that sort of thing. It can be part of it as well. But of course, it's also important to remember that because it's a human activity, there are potentials for the dark side of things to happen as well. So, you know, the networking could form some kind of club, which is about keeping people out, not letting people in. There could be some of those challenges. In the UK, we might call it the old boys network, which is what our politics at the moment are suffering from, very much so. So, you know, there's some of those issues. And I think it's always important to remember that both coaching and mentoring can be problematic as human activities. And that brings in the big question of ethics.
Of course.
And are our coaches and mentoring not following rules of ethics, but thinking and behaving in an ethical manner? And I think that's challenging.
It's for sure is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So in our first, when Kirsten was having her session, I asked her about, does mentoring have to be learned, or is it something that is so natural for us that you just pick a mentor from the street and to do mentoring? I mean, to which extent, because we teach coaches, right?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So using psychology, one of the main drivers for people to become mentors is called the generativity concept. And that means the desire to bring on other people, which is a strong human motivation, because if we don't bring on other people, we don't survive as a race, basically, the human race. So there is a strong driving instinct, and there will be some people who are naturally better at it than others. That's true. But I'm a great believer that mentors need development in the same way that coaches do. And you can become a much better mentor if you understand some of the key principles that are involved about how, for example, you make use of your experience. It's not about saying, I know I can solve your problem. It's much more about, I've experienced this. What do you think about that? How might that show up in your life? Or does it not show up in your life? So it's a different kind of conversation. And I think getting people who are wanting to be mentors to understand that it's not about, I can solve your problems for you, or I can tell you what to do or give you advice. It's much more about facilitating, as Reinhard Stelter says, a dialogue with somebody, which is helpful, developmental, full of learning for people. So yeah, development, and actually I would also argue that ongoing development is necessary for both coaches and mentors. I'm currently doing some research, big research project, actually. It's been going on for nearly 2 years now, and we're kind of almost getting ready to publish some stuff about it. But we've been looking at this concept of what's been called by David Clutterbuck and David Meganson as coach maturity. And we've been looking at it and interviewing people. And we've also applied it to people who are mentors as well. And we've come to the conclusion that coach maturity is not the right term, not the right way of thinking about it, because it seems to suggest you've arrived somewhere. And what we are talking about at the moment is that somebody who is developed as a coach, as a mentor, is always in a state of becoming. So you don't arrive, you'll keep working on it, keep reflecting on it, keep thinking about what you're doing. And many of these people that we've interviewed talked about becoming more human, becoming doing less and being more, they talk about. And some of it has quite strong spiritual qualities attached to it. And it's interesting how they let go of competency frameworks so easily and just be with that other person and interact with them. And yeah, we've been finding that whole thing absolutely fascinating. And so that brings into question about, what does accreditation actually mean? Does it mean you've arrived somewhere? If so, I don't think that's helpful. What do we do about the ongoing process? And I think that's important for mentors and for coaches, that those people who seem to develop their abilities in this are constantly aware critically reflecting, learning, seeking learning opportunities to continuously develop as an ongoing process. It becomes a kind of life challenge. And these people become, they say they become a coach rather than it's a role they perform. And of course, we interviewed some people who weren't like that, who were doing it according to the process models and the frameworks and all those sorts of things. But we also came across people that were living it and being it. So rather a long answer, Paul, but I think it's an important one.
I would like to just round it off, because I don't think there are more questions.
Okay.
Just round it off and ask you.
Yep. Okay.
What is this journey? What has that given you as a person, as a professional?
Oh. Well, I take my own learning and my own development incredibly seriously, and I recognize that once I stop learning about this thing called mentoring and this thing called coaching, I might as well give up. Because human beings are so wonderfully interesting that there's always something new to learn. And I find that all the time when I'm working one-to-one with people or in groups like this, that somebody will say something, I think that's really interesting. I'd like to find out more about that or work on that. And, you know, I've shared some of the experiences I've learned from people I've coached. And, you know, paying attention to them and thinking about what you're learning from them is really, really helpful and important. You know, I shared the business about what goes in Australia. Well, that was somebody who I was coaching in Australia who told me the mentor pays. I thought it was a wonderful idea. You know, so it's ongoing learning, constant fascination, curiosity. That's what it's about. And I will continue to write about it. And think about it and research it and talk to other people about it. And long may that continue. Endlessly fascinating.
And this, I took a lot out of these things that I haven't thought about, and I really like your you know, the thing about erasing the definition and having different perspectives on it.
Yes.
That is really, really important.
Yes.
Because we are in a helping profession.
Absolutely.
We're not in coaching or in mentoring. We are in a helping and
I think so. Helping.
Developmental world, right?
Helping. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Bob, for your
yeah.
Or do you have more?
There's two questions. We'll come back to the beginning.
Okay.
Time for you to think about so what. I think some of you have said that already, but do think so what and what next. Really important questions, I think. They're questions that drive me all the time. How's this relating to me, my experience, and how might that play out in the future? I think that's really important. And the very last slide is a little bit of a plug because my book is out. Yeah. It came out last month. Coaching and Mentoring Theory and Practice, 4th edition. 4 editions. I just can't believe it. And that's another example of how from the first edition, which came out in 2004, thinking has changed and developed and stuff's gone on, more research has been done, and we end up with a 4th edition. And one other comment to finish is, if you've seen any of the earlier editions, there's a 3rd name on the bottom that some of you may know of. That's David Meganson, who sadly died in July this year after a long illness. We talked to David when we were commissioned, and he wasn't able to take part in the 4th edition at all, but he's acknowledged in the book and his presence is still in there. Some of the chapters that he wrote still exist in that book. We've adapted and changed them a little bit. So David Meganson, who contributed an awful lot to the coaching mentoring world, I think we have a lot to thank him for. And Rabbi knows him well.
I do.
Well,
I second.
Yeah.
I second that. I also knew David from EMCC, and it was really a great resource.
Yes,
so,
absolutely. absolutely. Yeah.
Yes,
We,
Well,
we
yeah.
miss him.
Yeah.
By the way,
yeah.
in the materials, I'll put a link to Amazon. I think you probably that's
Yes,
the
yeah, it's available there. But all that research about the cases is in the book, as well as, you know, all sorts of other things. So thank you very much. I'll stop that share now and just say thank you. So nice to see everybody. Thank you for coming. I have to say that Rabbi and myself go back a very long time in history. And it's just so nice to see him today. So yeah, good to see you here. Yeah.
great. Thank you, everybody.